Okay, so this is a continuation. We were talking about biodiversity, okay? And first of all, do you recall what biodiversity means? No? Like, it just already slipped our mind? A diverse life, what does that mean? Okay, changes of natural selection on species, yes. What are you thinking, Romy?
I was saying total variability in living systems.
Way to go ahead and read ahead on the definition. So bio is life and diversity is differences, what makes us different. So when we talk about the earth, we talk about it that it's very biodiverse, meaning that there's a lot of different forms of life, okay? So that's where we're at here. Does having different forms of life benefit us as a species? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Can you tell me one reason how we benefit because other things are different?
Things or us?
Any living things, other things.
Increase our chances of survival.
How is it increasing our chances? That's a great answer, but how?
Let's say some people in the population have like resistance to diseases.
Mm-hmm.
They all die. They
Okay, so you're just talking about within our species.
well, like you say, like a corn crop.
Okay.
Maybe like a string of like corn crops have resistance to some like bacteria that they can survive.
Do they? Okay, so that they can feed us. Yes, because we are all different, we don't compete directly. So like us and corn aren't competing for a food source, true or false? Now there are other organisms that have similar competitive mechanisms, but then they have those, but are they, let's just talk about food, are many plants fighting for food? No, and the ones that that are, I don't know if you remember in 1406 we talked about the tall pine trees, like they get a little bit taller to compete, which is, they're not growing this way, they're growing this way because they're competing for the sunlight. So there's competition. The fact that we're diversified increases our chances of survival because it increases or it spreads out our limiting factors, things like shelters, waters, competition for mates and stuff like that. So diversity definitely benefits us. And it mentions that all forms of life will benefit from this, okay? And when it's saying there's biodiversity is beneficial outside of even what humans would use it for. So by definition, biodiversity is the total variability in living systems. So how everything is different. And what exactly makes humans different than dogs? Those are different from cats, that are different from bacteria. Genetics, our genes, our DNA. Okay? Now, that makes us different within different species or among different species. What makes us different within our species? It's still genetics, but we all have very similar DNA. How is it that we're different? Mutation? Say it one more time. What about those characteristics? Because remember those characteristics, when people throw out characteristics or traits, what are they really talking about? Phenotype. But when you say, oh, it's in their genes, or it's in their, that's a characteristic of them, or that's a trait. Where is that information? In their DNA. So we all have the DNA, we all have characters and traits. Like we all have an eye color, we all have a hair color. Why are our eyes and hair color not all the same? What is it about that message? What is genetic variation? Tell me what's different. What is different? Alleles, the mutations, what did you say, Dorian? Gains, that adds to that variation. What is it that's different? And it's like basic, go back to the structure of DNA. DNA is a nucleic acid. The sequence, the A's, the T's, the C's, the G's, the order that your letters go in. So we all have A, T, C, and G in our DNA. Fact, we already know that. But my order of A, T, C's, and G's is slightly different than yours, which is what causes our differences within our own species. So we do have the same characters. We do have the same genes. It's just that those nitrogenous bases, those A's, T's, C's, and G's, are in a different order, which makes us slightly different and neither more or less adapted to our environment. Okay? And it, again, talks about, this is something that you and I already discussed, but benefits that biodiversity provides just to humans alone. The one we didn't discuss was drugs, but this is how, like, you and I use bacteria. We can use cows to get proteins in their milk. We can use goats. We use all different types of animals that have a genetic makeup similar to ours, and we go through what we call gene therapy. Or, like, for bacteria, what we've done now is take the gene out of a human that makes insulin, put it into a bacteria. Now the bacteria makes insulin, and guess who makes insulin faster, us or bacteria? Bacteria, and they can do it, like, exponentially faster than us. So if we can get the bacteria to make that insulin, does the bacteria need insulin? Mm-mm. So we harvest that insulin, put it together, sell it to you, and help you keep your diabetes under control. So that's just one example of a drug, the way we can do that. But we use a lot of bacteria and algae, protist, for human activities. So here's the issue. Because being biodiversified is so beneficial to us, now we're starting to see the impact of human activities. And I don't think any of this is anything very new to you. We're just kind of highlighting a few things. So here we're going to discuss deforestation, pollution, and exotic species. Just a kind of a time-lapse photo. In 1975, compared to 2009, the difference in the primary producers. What are primary producers? Plants. Plants. You can clearly see quite a bit of plant life there. Now, a specific species, no, this is a satellite type picture. But look at what's happening here. What has happened in that time frame? They may have died off. But at that fast of a rate? What? They got cut down. If these were big trees in these certain areas, these are areas that have been depleted of those primary producers, or those primary producers have been removed. Can you tell me what kind of things would cause that? A human going in and saying, that looks like a really good spot for my home. My home. This looks like a really good place for my new manufacturing plant. This looks like a really good place for my 4-story garage. The funny things that we do. So we've cleared out these plants, and we're like, it's not really a big deal. There's plenty of other plants. But you can see a difference just in a satellite image on the amount of plants that have been removed. And then look at the title real quick. Deforestation, like we're cutting it down. Overexploitation, these are two things that we're going to cover as we go a little bit further, and extinction of rates. So habitat fragmentation. What does it mean to fragment something? To break it off. Okay, so habitat fragmentation means we have this nice large habitat and we begin to break it up for some reason or another. And this is because of human use. But it mentioned overall habitat fragmentation is the reduction to a smaller, isolated, the habitats get smaller because humans are infringing on their natural habitat. It makes these patches smaller, and it lowers their carrying capacity. Does anyone know what carrying capacity is? How many organisms that habitat can support? And when we do research, we can see carrying capacities at the beginning. We have like 20 organisms, and then they multiply until the population's like, let's say, at 100. And then at 101, there's not enough food, so what happens to that 101 person? They die, and it kind of sets our carrying capacity of saying, this land, these resources can support 100 organisms. So if our resources get smaller, our carrying capacity also decreases. So it increases that competition. And what's causing these smaller patches, we talked about the fragmentation, is human use. So here was one big, large habitat, and then we brought a highway in between it. So now we have, this is a habitat, a smaller patch, and this is a habitat, a smaller patch that's been separated by this road, but can these organisms inhabit this road? No, and so we're separating this, all leads to speciation, which we talked about in a previous chapter, and other aspects that we've discussed previously. Edge effects. What an edge effect is where you have two habitats that were isolated, and as things change and their environments get manipulated, the habitats kind of start to overlap. So you have one area where, let's say, a certain bird lives and is very dominant, and another area where a different species of bird lives and is very dominant. And over time, these two habitats kind of get pushed together so that there's some overlap. It kind of looks like a Venn diagram if you look at them, some diagrammatic representations. But that area of overlap becomes an issue because you have two dominant bird species. That I'm the king of this area and you're the king of this area, and now we have some overlap. That starts to cause problems for the biodiversity in the species there. Okay, and it's specifically talking about songbirds, and that's why I use that. Not only is there dominance in a specific species, but there's an increase in predators now. Okay, and so nest predation. What's brood parasitism? So brood is all their babies. What's parasitism? Yeah, like you're using them for something. So it could be like a parasite, like an insect or something coming and leeching from it, or it could be another organism going and saying, oh, well, here, you've gotten this food, I need you to feed my kids. So it becomes, the competition level increases. And the problem is that they've never had that same competition, so you have two choices. You can either adapt or die. Pollution is nothing new to any of us either. So we already know that based on what's going on, and I think we even had this discussion the other day, a lot of our pollutants become airborne. And they get stuck in the atmosphere, and they come down in the form of acid rain. And I think that was a topic we had discussed. But acid precipitation tends to increase in areas where there's high amounts of industry. Like you can go towards Waxahachie and you can see Owens Corning. And every time you drive by that plant, not only does it smell kind of bad, but you can see huge plumes of waste, or exhaust, but waste, going out. And it never fails. Like it always smells bad there. And you can kind of see some discoloration on the abiotic factors, like the bridges and buildings around there. So when it rains, like they start to discolor it. And that's just one small local example. That's not counting everything else that's going on in that region, all over the world, in specific areas, ecosystems, anywhere. So pollution is not anything new to people. Right here, what this is trying to show, and this is just using coal mining as an example for pollution. It's giving you the pH of the rain as the rain is coming, so the acid rain. And what do you know about pH? Where's neutral? 7. And does anybody remember the pH of your stomach? Lower-ish? 2-ish. 2.5, 2.5. Okay? So here we have between 4 and 5. So slightly more acidic than your stomach, but definitely not neutral, which you would expect out of rain, because it's just water. Okay? And you can tell that just based on coal burning plants, coal mining places, that the acid rain is less prevalent here, but still slightly acidic, but it becomes more and more acidic as we have this condensation. Not condensation. What do you call it when you put a whole bunch? Yeah, condension. Yeah, condense. That's right. That's the right word. But it could also be collection. Yes, Dorian, thank you for helping me increase my vocabulary. Biomagnification. Does anybody know what this is? This is one of my favorite topics. Biological magnification is the exact opposite of a food pyramid or a food chain. It basically says the higher you are on the food chain, the more pollution you're exposed to. The higher you are on the food chain, the more pollution you are exposed to. And it's using DDT again, which is no longer, you're not allowed to use anymore. But this is a really good example, and it's an example that's used in all books. So what happens is we put this chemical, DDT, all over this stuff, and we see that in water, it begins to kind of dilute itself, and that's fine. So it's telling you parts per million how much DDT we can find in the water. But when we look at living organisms like zooplankton, okay, so zoo tells you it's animal-like plankton. So zooplankton, we can see that there's quite markedly more DDT in their systems. Concentration is higher in their systems than it is in the water alone. How is it that these zooplankton got that chemical in them in the first place? Through the water. If they're living underwater, guess what they have to respire using? Water, yeah. So that and the fact that they intake water through their mouth, so they're getting that pollution. Okay, now we go a little bit higher on the food chain. So our plants are going to use it, and I didn't even include them in my food chain yet, or at all at this point. But our plants, and then they will eat that. They'll eat the plant, and they'll have it within the water. Then we have our secondary consumer that eats that zooplankton. Why is it that there's more DDT in this organism than there is in the zooplankton? They eat that, and what do they just need one zooplankton? How many zooplankton do they need to eat? A lot. And as you get higher in that food chain, guess what happens to your diet? Can you eat just a couple plants? You and I are on a situation where basically it's accepted in society that how many meals should you be eating a day? 3, and then 2 snacks, and that's a lot of eating, and that's because our energy resources are small and we don't get a lot of energy from our food, so we have to eat a lot. So as we move up the food chain, you're supposed to eat more because you get less energy from them because you're higher on the food chain. So the more you eat, the more poison you're exposed to, so that by the time it makes its way to the top of the food chain, there's a whole lot of poison in those organisms. So this is when we have organisms that, for all intents and purposes, look fine, and then all of a sudden they're dead. And we can run and see that they have indeed been poisoned. So this is called biomagnification or biological magnification. And it's specifically talking about toxins and the increase of toxins as you, the increase in concentration of toxins as you move up a food chain. The increase in the concentration of toxins as you move up the food chain. Exotic species. So whenever we talk about exotic species, what this takes us into is a situation where non-native. What does it mean by non-native? Not supposed to be there. Non-native species, and this is because of humans, are being introduced to new populations, new communities. And it seems really cool at first because you're like, oh, this is this really cool bird, or this is this really cool lizard, and it can do all this really cool stuff, and it's so pretty, and da-da-da. But it becomes a huge problem. Because the fact it's not native, or it's not supposed to be there, there's no real regulation on it. Meaning there's no natural predators. Okay? And then whatever it finds its food source to be, because there's no natural predators keeping that population in check, what happens to the population of that non-native species? It gets really, really big. And now I can outnumber the native species. And because there's more of me, that's less competition for me, more competition for you. And what do we see start happening to these native species because of these non-native? They go extinct because we just kind of push them out. I don't know how many of you have heard of zebra mussels in the lakes, and there's a huge campaign, a boat campaign about all that. So the zebra mussels were found in this one body of water where people had put their boats in, and they had attached themselves to the boat, which is what they do, to the propellers and to the bottom of the boats. So the boaters would take their boats out, and they would go from one lake that had that to another lake that didn't have that. And as soon as they put their boat in the water, those zebra mussels were then introduced to this new ecosystem where there was no competition. And guess what they were able to do? grow and multiply uncontrollably. And they've become a problem for not only the biodiversity, the life in that ecosystem, but also for the people who use the water for recreation, because those zebra mussels can damage your boat. So that's an example of that. Here's another example of a vine. The kudzu vine is supposed to be the vine that ate the South. So, of course, this was something I wasn't really familiar with when I first came across it, so I was like, what does it mean, ate the South? There are quite a few, like, I don't know what they're, I want to say it's like a fable, but it's not. It's like wives' tales, maybe, where it was just kind of passed on. But this vine was introduced. Somebody had brought it in and said, oh, when they went, I believe it was Italy. They visited Italy, brought it back from Italy, put it on their porch. It was really pretty. They liked it. And this was like in the 1800s, I want to say. Anyways, it started growing like crazy. Nothing was there that was consuming it. Nothing ate it naturally. So it continued to grow. Well, because it kind of took over everything, somewhere down the road, somebody started saying, this is where snakes hide. And this is where, like, bad things hide. So it became feared by the kids. So kids would walk away and try to stay away from these vines, because if you got near the vines, they would eat you. And that's how that story went on. Because I was like, what do you mean it ate the South? But it technically didn't. What they mean by that part, it's a kid saying that if you get near the vine, it'll eat you. But the fact it was invasive, it came in and took over and had no natural predators. It basically functions like a weed, and it will overcrawl and overcome all anything not live. What is the word? Plants. The word I'm looking for. It will choke out all the natural plants in that area, whatever that word is I'm trying to say. Overexploitation means that I'm taking too much from that area. And again, this is because of humans. We see issues with farmers who are trying to over-farm land. I just have to keep a crop in, I have to keep a crop in, I have to keep a crop in. So, of course, that's their livelihood, and that's how they get their money. But what do they do to the soil? They leach it. They take all the nutrients from the soil, and of course, it costs more for the fertilizers and such to be put down so that that crop is successful. We start to see slow population declines, so each crop gets a little weaker, and that's just talking about the crops, but what about the insects that feed on those crops, and so on. You either adapt or die, and what we're talking about now is there's a whole field of science, conservation science, conservation biology, and that's what you study. How do I save these situations where these living organisms have been overexploited? How do I get them back and help them come back as opposed to going extinct? Okay, and that's what it's talking about here. The extinction, overall, you know what extinctions are, but in the past, and this is actually, I think, on our next test, we call them mass extinctions. There have been 5 mass extinctions, and they believe right now that we're in the middle of the 6th one. And the cause of the mass extinctions in the past have been like asteroids and like big time things, and the cause of this extinction is us. Yeah, us. So here's my conservation biologist, and again, this is a new field and study. It's probably about 10 to 12 years. They have degree programs on this now, and like the game warden type thing, they're part of that conservation effort. But ultimately, their goal is to bring back these populations and help protect them from the humans that are endangering them. We do have some biodiversity hotspots. What that means to be considered a biodiverse hotspot, you have a large number of endemic species that are threatened by human activities. Endemic means these are species that we only find in that area. So these are unique to this area. And they are endangered, of course, because of some human impact, some human activity. The goal of conservation biologists is to help to preserve whatever biodiversity is found in that hotspot. And just so that we're clear, I realize the topic is hotspots, but are hotspots the only place that we practice conservation? I just don't want you to think in your head that, oh, well, if it's not a hotspot, we're not really worried about conserving it. These are just some examples where those species are endemic, meaning you don't find them in other areas and you can't bring them back in and carry them and start a new population. Here's kind of pointing out a lot of these hotspots, and this probably shouldn't surprise you if you think big picture, but they're islands. And why would they be islands as opposed to mainland? Yeah, they're like, these species have been isolated there for so long, and then you have some rich millionaire who's like, I want my own island, and I want a hotel on that island, and I want to make millions of dollars by selling access to this. So you can tell, and even just looking at the topography, you can see these are all kind of coastal or islands where these species are unique there. Okay, yeah. So in conservation biology, our goal is to preserve, conserve, and then restore. So preserve, conserve, and restore. We also have to consider economic factors because bottom line, when we're preserving and conserving these, does that mean that there's not going to be any human influence? Has anybody heard of like the Corps of Engineers lakes and stuff like that? Like in Texas, and there's Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers, they go in and they help maintain the lake, but then there's parts that don't get mowed or aren't touched. They're just the natural habitat. So that's going to be one of the, like an example I can show you. We're conserving the biodiversity there, but allowing human access so that we can raise the funds to continue that conservation. So we allow humans to have access to certain areas and not all areas to protect those native species. So preservation would be to enforce just a strict land use. There's some times where humans can have no access, and that's the example that's going to be shown here and the one that's in your book. Mixed use conservation is where you can use some of it and some of it you can't use, which would be like our Corps of Engineers. And then restoration, our goal is to bring back, reestablish, and help these small species begin to thrive again within that community and ecosystem, within their communities and ecosystem. Ecotourism, this is where visitors pay a fee. Good thing is, you're getting money off access to that. Bad thing is, even though you say don't go in that area and this area is strictly off limits, guess what happens? Somebody's going to go. Somebody's going to go. Okay, if they're like, don't go down there, there's alligators. Most people would be terrified. But then there's some that are like, well, I want to see. And I want to catch it. So that's just what we're dealing with there. So you have access to it. It helps to generate funds. But our goal is to preserve most of those endemic species. Ecosystem valuation. Basically, we're putting a price on that land with all its biodiversity, and that includes plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, all life forms there. If it's an area that is to be conserved, and a lot of this is willed or by the government, like, for example, I die and I own a lot of property. If I don't will it to a certain person or a certain cause, then it goes up for sale and whoever pays the highest gets to use it for whatever purpose. But if I will that land cannot be developed, then that land is not, they're not allowed to put houses there or anything like that. And so a lot of the government has done that to large portions of the land as well. Does that mean that land is not worth anything? No. And that there's a lot of that stuff that's in court, and you'll see it now. Sometimes, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this area, but there's been fields here forever, and those fields are slowly becoming what? Developed. They're becoming housing additions. There was one tract of land that I used to walk through all the time to get to my friend's house, and I swear it wasn't that big, and there's probably 50 homes on it now, and I'm like, and they're super close together, but 50 homes at $300,000 each, I mean, and they probably bought that property for, let's say, $2 million. That's nothing when you can continue to collect interest and a mortgage from those people. So, and it's really hard to fight when people are like, hey, well, we're trying to save life, and other people come back and say, well, we need homes. Those are really difficult fights, but we value how we value that property. And this is the example that I was mentioning in your textbook. It's a very unique example. I like it because for most of the year, this area is shut down, but in January, it's open harvest. So organisms and people can have access to it. But every other month of the year, it's shut down to keep that area conserved or preserved. Okay, so it's mentioned in your text, and it's a highlight story. So, any questions here?